Airstrikes, fighting break Russian-declared ceasefire in Syria's Aleppo by Lisa Barrington. Beirut. Fierce fighting and airstrikes broke the third day of a four-day unilateral Russian ceasefire in the divided Syrian city of Aleppo on Saturday, a monitor said. The first Syrian or Russian airstrikes on Aleppo since Russia began the pause in hostilities on Thursday hit a key front line in the city's southwest, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said. Clashes and shelling, which had continued throughout the day on front lines, intensified late in the day, a witness and the observatory said. Airstrikes had continued to target areas outside the city throughout the ceasefire. Russia has been announcing daily that it will abide by the next day of the series of daytime ceasefires, which it said it called to allow civilians and rebels to leave the besieged city, but no announcement was made on Saturday. There have been nighttime clashes as each day of the ceasefire has ended, but Saturday saw much fiercer fighting plus the first airstrikes. Aleppo was Syria's most populous city before the war, but is now divided into government and rebel-held areas. Intense bombardment has reduced the rebel-held east of the city to ruins. Once again, no medical evacuations or aid deliveries to rebel-held areas were possible on Saturday, the United Nations said. Rebels did not accept the ceasefire, which they say does nothing to alleviate the situation or those who choose to remain in rebel-held eastern Aleppo, and believe it is part of a government policy to purge cities of political opponents. The Syrian army and Russia had called on residents and rebels in eastern Aleppo to leave through designated corridors and depart for other insurgent-held districts under a promise of safe travel, but very few rebels or civilians appeared to have left. Nobody has left through the corridors. The small number of people who tried to leave were faced with shelling around the corridor area and could not leave, said Zakaria Malahifi, a rebel official with the Fastaqim group, which is present in the city. Syrian state media says rebels have been preventing civilians from leaving East Aleppo. Pro-government channels broadcast footage of ambulances and green buses parked at empty reception points in government-held Aleppo, said to be waiting for civilians and fighters from the city's east. Besieged East Aleppo has not received United Nations assistance since early July, and rebel groups have said they are preparing an attack to try to break through the government siege. The United Nations had hoped that the ceasefires would allow medical evacuations and aid deliveries, but said a lack of security guarantees had prevented aid workers from taking advantage of the pause in bombing. The UN remains hopeful that parties will provide all necessary guarantees and is actively working to that end, UN humanitarian spokesman Jens Lark said. He said humanitarian workers were ready to proceed as soon as conditions allowed. The situation on the ground remains volatile as exchanges of fire and clashes continue. Just today, bullets struck the hotel where the UN hub is based and critically injured one hotel staff, Lark said. Sporadic clashes between insurgents and Syrian government and allied forces had been reported earlier on Saturday along front lines, with some shells falling on both the government-held western side of the city and the rebel-held east, the observatory said. Aleppo has been a major battleground in the Syrian conflict, now in its sixth year. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, backed by the Russian military, Iran's Revolutionary Guards, and an array of Shiite Muslim militias, wants to take full control of the city. Syrian and Russian forces say they are targeting fighters linked to al-Qaeda from Jabhat Fateh al-Sham, formerly known as the Nusra Front, in eastern Aleppo. Insurgents say Syria and Russia are indiscriminately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure to take over rebel-held eastern Aleppo. Diplomatic negotiations between Russia and the United States have in recent weeks focused on whether there's a way to separate al-Qaeda-linked fighters in eastern Aleppo from more moderate rebels, thereby depriving Syrian and Russian forces of their main targets. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Saturday Russia remains committed to removing what it calls terrorist organizations from Syria and preventing the disintegration of the country. We need to liberate and do everything possible to prevent the division of the country, Peskov said in a televised interview, adding that he did not see an end to the Syria conflict in the foreseeable future. Asked if future extensions of the Aleppo pause were under discussion, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov was quoted by RIA news agency earlier on Saturday as saying it depends on the actions of other parties. We'll see how today goes. At the highest level, it's already been said that extending the pause depends not on our possibilities, but it largely depends on whether there is a proper movement from the opposite direction, he said.
Rock star Sting headlined a concert in Paris' Bataclan Music Hall on Saturday to mark the venue's reopening a year after 3 Islamist militants gunned down 90 revelers in France's bloodiest terror attack. Sting, who fronted the hit pop band The Police before a long solo career, opened the emotionally charged gig with a minute of silence, telling the crowd, "We will not forget them." Tonight we have 2 tasks to achieve. First, to remember those who lost their lives in the attack, and then to celebrate the life and the music in this historic place, the performer said. On November 13th, 2015, the assailants burst through the music hall's main entrance and sprayed automatic gunfire into the crowd as the Californian rock band The Eagles of Death Metal played on stage. During a more than 2-hour-long assault, the attackers executed some victims and took others hostage. The attack ended after 1 militant was shot dead, and the 2 others killed themselves by detonating explosive vests. In coordinated strikes that night, other gunmen and suicide bombers targeted a soccer stadium and several cafes in Paris. In all, the Islamic State militants killed 130 people. Adrian, a survivor of the Bataclan attack who lost 2 friends that night, said, "It was my duty to come to remember those who died here." As the concert hall emptied, another concertgoer said, "Tonight was beautiful. He set the place alight and we forgot our fears." The Paris attacks prompted the government to impose a state of emergency, which remains in place, following attacks this summer in Nice and Normandy. Writing in an opinion column published in several European newspapers on Saturday, Prime Minister Manuel Valls said the heavy and constant threat of more terror attacks hung over France and urged Europe to strengthen its defense capabilities. And this is all the more so as the United States becomes less and less involved in the affairs of the world. Europe could no longer shirk its responsibilities and take refuge behind its American ally, Valls wrote. Proceeds from Saturday's Bataclan gig will go to 2 charities helping survivors of the Paris attacks. Long live the Bataclan, Sting said as he left the stage. This article was written by Elizabeth Pineau. Additional writing by Richard Lowe.
Britain will continue to play a full role until we leave, Prime Minister Theresa May told fellow leaders at her first EU summit. But for many Britons in Brussels, that is a forlorn hope. Formally, yes, the heads of European Union institutions say Britain and its citizens will keep seats at council tables and in Parliament, or go on with EU civil service careers in the 2 to 3 years left before it quits the 28-nation bloc. In reality, say British lawmakers and officials in Brussels, some of whom were offered trauma counseling by employers after the Brexit referendum 4 months ago to the day, they are already being sidelined and expect further isolation. Why should anyone listen to us, said a British member of the European Parliament who forecast a December midterm reshuffle of posts, such as committee chairs, will see many compatriots lose out. People are polite, sympathetic, the MEP told Reuters, but in the end, of course, we are leaving. Although May cautioned fellow leaders not to bind Britain by decisions taken without her, as at last month's summit of 27 in Bratislava, they insist the EU must move on and are annoyed, for example, by London trying to thwart more EU defense cooperation. The leader of German Chancellor Angela Merkel's centre-right bloc in the European Parliament took to the BBC's flagship news show during last week's summit to warn Britons that such awkward tactics risk poisoning May's efforts to cut the kind of divorce deal she wants, keeping trade ties while curbing immigration. That is creating a lot of anger, Manfred Weber said of British opposition to new plans for EU defense cooperation that London says might hamper NATO. Please don't block it because that would have a lot of impact on the Brexit negotiations. Acknowledging Britain retains veto powers and votes in the EU for now, Weber said, "It's a question of behavior, whether you respect each other, not a question of rights." Most British MEPs, including most of May's Conservatives, opposed Brexit. There has been anger at those who did not. EU Chief Executive Jean-Claude Juncker demanded of UKIP leader Nigel Farage in the chamber in June, "Why are you still here?" A German MEP, speaking anonymously, since parties have yet to take positions on December's jobs round, sees a rout of British influence. The midterm changes may reflect the new balance of powers, with UK MEPs probably being removed from positions. But despite some pressure from fellow MEPs to exclude the British now, lawyers advise that the 73 Britons in the 751-seat chamber must stay and be able to vote, even on laws that may not affect Britain, or indeed those such as the form of the final divorce that affect it very particularly. Few expect the British to take part in the 2019 EU elections, however. British officials representing London and the many councils of the European Union in Brussels say they are aware of the delicacy of their position, but must defend the national interest on a range of issues, from fishing quotas to budget amendments that have immediate impacts before Britain leaves. Yet, as negotiators on both sides are preparing for formal talks to start by March, in which continental and British diplomats will find themselves on opposite sides of the table, Britain's backroom envoys in Brussels are avoiding taking too much of a role in discussions on longer-term policy issues. That would be a bit weird, one acknowledged. So far, British officials say, attitudes to them in meetings have not changed hugely as long as they get the tone right. Britons are keeping especially active in discussions on issues where there will continue to be close cooperation post-Brexit, such as foreign and defense policy, as May herself did during summit talks on Syria, Russia, and migration. May's predecessor, David Cameron, even appointed a new British member to Juncker's European Commission to replace an ally who, like Cameron, resigned after the Brexit vote. Julian King is now running security policy for the EU executive. British civil servants in Brussels have been assured by Juncker that for now their jobs are safe, but as non-EU citizens they will need special dispensations to work for the Union, and many are considering their options. One EU job not so far open to them, and unlikely to be, is that of Brexit negotiator. Former French Foreign Minister Michel Barnier, the man Juncker has appointed to run the talks, and his German deputy have not appointed any Britons to their team. People familiar with the new operation say security will be tight, including to prevent leaks to London, and Barnier has told colleagues he would like negotiations to be held in French, though he denied on Friday being set on the idea. Britons near retirement are expected to stay on. Of others, some have dual nationality and can switch their official passport. Many in mid-career are looking at the private sector, or at what many expect to be a major expansion in parts of Whitehall, the British government's administration. One mid-ranking EU official said he had seen at least one fellow Briton passed over for what, pre-referendum, had seemed a certain promotion. "It's clear we have no future here," he said. "Leaving sooner rather than later may make sense." This article posted by Alistair MacDonald.
Will be blocked.
Personally, I don't think so. I wouldn't prosecute a transaction if I felt that didn't have the conditions to succeed. Certainly, without prejudging regulators, of course, review and decision, that we have a very, very solid case.
Has Xavier Rollet gone some way towards assuaging your fears, or would he need to still go a bit further?
I think he's made a very good case. I would like to see more details of exactly how the cross-margining would work and whether or not there would be less margin in the system than before.
Philip Coggan and Xavier Rollet, thank you both very much. You've been listening to The Economist Asks, and you can read our ongoing coverage of the London Stock Exchange merger at economist.com. In London, this is The Economist.
The Economist.
In 2007, 16-year-old Tyler Hill died while on a student trip to Japan. Hospital officials say his life could have been saved had he received immediate attention there, but it didn't happen. Let's make sure Tyler's story is not repeated. The cause is clear. Keep kids safe. Find out more at clearcausefoundation.org.
Children of America.
Did you know that 63% of homes contain allergens from cockroaches? And that mice spread potent asthma triggers found in 82% of homes? It's true. Common household pests are major offenders on the list of indoor allergens. Learn what you can do to help your family breathe easier. Visit pestworld.org. A public service message from the National Pest Management Association and the Asthma and Allergy Foundation of America.
When Dad needed help getting around, I became his driver. Any daughter would do the same. But soon enough, he needed help doing more things, and it was up to me to be his personal shopper and financial manager, too. And before I knew it, Dad moved in with me, so I became his cook, his personal assistant, his physical therapist, and even his nurse. When I started taking care of Dad, I didn't realize all the roles I'd have to play. But no matter what, I know I'm still his daughter.
We understand the many roles you play. And to help, we created an online caregiving resource center. At aarp.org/caregiving, you can find resources and connect with the caregiving community. Together, we can better care for ourselves and the ones we love. Visit aarp.org/caregiving to learn more. A public service announcement brought to you by AARP and the Ad Council.
The Economist.
In London, this is The Economist, and you're listening to Babbage, a weekly conversation on science and technology. I'm Kenneth Cukier, the data editor, and I'm joined today by Ludwig Siegele, our technology editor, and Jason Palmer, our science correspondent. Hey, Ludwig.
Hello.
Jason.
Hello.
Hi. Thanks for joining us. On this episode, we're going to discuss a controversial European ruling on cross-border data flows. And we're going to look at the Nobel Prizes. They've been awarded in the sciences. We've got medical physiology, physics, and chemistry. Ludwig, let's start with you. There was a ruling this week from the EU Court of Justice on data transfer agreements between Europe and the U.S. What's happening?
It's called the Safe Harbor Pact, and the Safe Harbor Pact is a treaty between the U.S. and the EU, and what it tried to do is bridge the differences between the U.S. and the EU when it comes to privacy. So data protection in the U.S. is more a consumer protection issue, so you can negotiate, you can make trade-offs, you make exceptions for intelligence services. But in the EU, it's a fundamental human right, so it is non-negotiable. And so that's a big difference, so that's why data protection laws in Europe are much stricter. And so that Safe Harbor Pact, which was signed 15 years ago, tried to bridge those differences by basically saying, yes, if you're an American company, you can send personal data over to and store it and process it in the U.S. on your service there if you sign up to certain rules outlined in the Safe Harbor Agreement.
So this week the court overturned it, is that right?
That is correct. So what happened is when the data agreement or the Safe Harbor Agreement was signed 15 years ago, there were not many data flows across the Atlantic. Privacy wasn't really politically that important in Europe. That has changed, of course, a lot. You have now about, I think, 5,000 companies signed up to Safe Harbor. I mean, the trickle of data across the Atlantic has turned into a tsunami. And politically, of course, this has become much more important because of the revelations by Snowden, the former NSA contractor. So the political pressure has grown to renegotiate that Safe Harbor Agreement, which is basically based on self-certification by American companies, so there's no enforcement, all of that. Then an Austrian campaigner filed a suit against the Irish data protection authorities saying basically Facebook doesn't protect my data, can't protect my data, hence the Safe Harbor Agreement is invalid. The case wound its way up the courts and ended up at the European Court of Justice, and that court now decided, indeed, the Safe Harbor Agreement is invalid. You have to look for other legal avenues to allow for data transfers to the U.S.
So what will the practical implication of the ruling be for companies like Google and Facebook?
So Safe Harbor isn't, as I just said, is not the only legal avenue which allows you or makes it possible for you to transfer data to the U.S., European personal data. There are model contracts, basically templates of contracts developed by the EU you can sign or both parties can sign. There's other rules. So what companies now have to do, since Safe Harbor, the pact is no longer valid, is kind of look for another legal basis for the data transfer. The other possibility is, of course, that they shift to European data centers and basically not send the data over to the U.S.
Wouldn't that be the logical way they would go forward? You can have a technological solution. You just don't transfer it to the U.S.
That is true, but I mean, there are certain costs associated with that. I mean, if you have to build new data centers, and depending how far this goes, it could also kind of lead to a further balkanization of the Internet. So if the EU insists on its privacy laws, companies have to localize data, build local data centers. Other companies may be encouraged to do the same. They've already done that post-Snowden. So it's kind of a further step towards a more balkanized Internet.
Can I jump in here? Isn't the natural outcome of all of this that everybody will eventually it'll be easier for everyone to act according to the strictest rules that prevail somewhere, such that, well, first of all, it'd be a good time to invest in data centers in the EU and so on. But with so many companies that span so many countries and so many users using services that in turn span so many countries, won't the average just end up being the strictest?
That's one school of thinking. I mean, then again, the European Union cannot expect kind of to impose its strict privacy laws on the entire world. You can argue the pros and cons of that approach. I think it would be not very efficient and not kind of not politically correct, but not very democratic to say, okay, we Europeans think that privacy is so important, so you, whatever, China or America or Mexico, you have to kind of comply with that strict standards. These countries may have other ideas when it comes to privacy. So I think the better solution is to have some kind of an international cooperation between countries, or bilaterally or even multilaterally, to common rules how to deal with privacy.
So in other words, what you're suggesting is Safe Harbor 2.
What I'm suggesting is Safe Harbor 2, and that's happening. There's negotiations between the EU and the US ongoing for now, I think, almost 2 years. A problem is there. They've agreed kind of on the commercial aspects to make it easier for example, EU consumers to go to the US and get their complaints resolved. But they have hit a snag, and the snag is it's the access to European data by U.S. authorities, meaning the NSA. And that's where the Americans do not want to compromise. The ruling will make this much more difficult because the court was clear in saying if there is undiscriminated access by U.S. authorities to data, European data in America, then meaning that there is no adequate safeguards to protect privacy.
Great. Thank you, Ludwig.
Thank you.
Jason, now let's turn to you. The Nobel Prizes were awarded for the sciences this week in medicine and physiology, physics and chemistry. I'm interested in what's happening in the medicine and the chemistry, but the physics in particular intrigues me. So why don't you give us a little quick tour of the horizon of the other two and drill down into neutrinos?
As for the medicine prize, that was given to a trio of researchers who effectively found ways to use nature against itself, to find new treatments for roundworm parasites and for malaria, both of which came from nature itself, not cooked up in a laboratory. A couple of researchers who were looking at some bacteria called streptomyces, and one of the chemicals that those bacteria produce can be turned into a drug that became called ivermectin, and that helped a lot with roundworm infection. That leads to river blindness and elephantiasis and a number of horrible conditions. And for the case of malaria, a Chinese researcher who effectively went through a big old book of ye olde Chinese medicines and found that one of them, which was helpful with animals infected with malaria, turned out, in fact, to be useful also for humans. And that's become a drug called artemisinin.
That sounds really great. So that's medicine.
That's medicine. And in chemistry, again, a trio of researchers. And again, we're kind of hovering around human biology concerns, which is kind of an ongoing, at least an internal joke for us about the chemistry prize, in that it's never really about chemistry. It's either about physics or about medicine again.
Not stamp collecting.
Absolutely not stamp collecting. This year has been given for a trio of researchers who basically unveiled how it is that DNA repairs itself. Now, we all know that DNA are the instructions that allow our cells to reproduce, and it's a big, long string of 4 repeating letters and so on, but the world is not really so simple as that. All sorts of things can mess up the copying mechanism that lets one cell turn into 2 cells, turn into 4, and so on, and turn into us. There's a bunch of ways that this can go wrong, mechanisms of damage, if you like. And the trio of researchers basically found the swarm of proteins that fix these things, that are basically the cell's proofreaders. They look at the DNA, find where the mistakes are, and fix them.
Okay, so we've got the medicine physiology, and we've got the medicine physiology dressed up as chemistry. So now physics.
So let's get absolutely away from anything that is immediately useful to humans and talk about the stuff that really messes with your head. Yes.
Exactly, quite. That's where I was headed with this. What is a neutrino, and what was the prize awarded for?
Let's start with what the name means. In Italian, it means little neutral ones. So they're little and they're neutral. That is, they have no electric charge. If you look at the periodic table of particles, if you like, so chemists have, the elements, physicists have the particles. These guys are really very light. There are 3 of them, and they really, really don't like to interact with anything. This is it. They're going through you right now. They're going through whatever device you're listening to this podcast on. They're flying through. They're not touching anything. That makes them very, very hard to catch. They were first put forward in 1930. It took over a quarter of a century for the very first one to be caught in a laboratory. Now, people have gotten a little more clever about this and doing this in different ways and have found out that there are 3 types, flavors they're called. They're thought to be massless. The rest of the periodic table of particles suggests they really ought to be massless. The prize was actually awarded for a couple of big teams working in giant underground, awesome-looking laboratories that found out these things change their flavor mid-flight. That, in turn, means that they have mass, if they have.
Why does that mean that they have mass?
That is an exceptionally hard question to answer in short order, but basically, if they can change from one moment to the next, then they experience time. If they experience time, then they're not going the speed of light, because if something's going the speed of light, then, hey, all time is the same, and if going slower than the speed of light, then mass. Is the short and slightly hand-wavy answer.
I'm sorry I asked. Okay, let's keep on going. So is there any application to the knowledge that these neutrinos change their flavor in flight?
Right, the inevitable and painful question. And in fact, it was asked during the announcement ceremony. Someone kind of kept pressing the Nobel laureate they had on the phone to say, yeah, but what does it really mean? Why does it really matter? One of the things is that it solves what's called the solar neutrino problem. The finding that they oscillate, that this sort of flavor flipping is called oscillation, solves that. Now, the good news, the practical news, the most practical news you're going to get out of me, Ken, is that makes us feel a lot more confident in our understanding of fusion processes, which is useful for energy making or for bomb making or for just the general physicist's comfort with the understanding of the world. So that's helpful. Something a little bit more profound, if not immediately useful, is, okay, if they have mass and the standard model is wrong, then there's this long chain of inferences that we can make that basically goes all the way back to the very beginning of the universe. And since these things have mass, there's some chance then that there were heavier versions of them way back when that decayed in various ways, and they solve, check this out, why we're here at all. One of the things that the existing theory says is at the beginning of the universe there was just an absolutely straight down the middle 50-50 mix of matter and antimatter. And you know, Ken, what happens when matter and antimatter meet, right?
Don't even get me started.
Right. Big flash of energy, right?
Exactly.
Which means basically in its absolute infancy the universe should have gone, big flash of light, that's it. Instead, it obviously stuck around for a while. So we're looking for any mechanism by which a little tiny bit of extra matter might have stuck around, even though lots of stuff will have annihilated and very bright and all very, the crucible of the formation of the universe. Turns out these heavy neutrinos of ye olde times that could exist, given these things have mass, could give us the way that finally explains why matter exists in the universe at all. This is the long way around to tell you it matters a lot, Ken.
That is really interesting. My head is completely spun. Most people around the world are ecstatic at the time of the Nobel Prizes being announced because it seems like an annual celebration of great invention and discovery. But Jason, I don't think you feel the same way.
I have a couple of reservations. Look, I love this spectacle too, and I sit down and I watch these announcements every year, and it's great to see how much people get into it and can feel engaged with science. Behind the scenes, a lot of people in my business and scientists themselves have their reservations about the way the prizes are done. It can only be given to a maximum of 3 people. All the people have to be alive. And of course, there are a lot of modes of discovery that require more than 3 people. So it necessarily kind of glosses over some of the contributions of lots of people. These giant underground labs didn't have just like one guy, one person in it, right? There are hundreds, sometimes